The morning sun cast long shadows across downtown Phoenix as Madison Riley adjusted her police radio and stepped out of her patrol car. At 28, she had already earned a reputation as one of the toughest officers in the department, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold. The emergency broadcast crackled through every device in the city simultaneously, delivering news that would change everything. A mysterious virus had begun spreading across the Southwest, turning ordinary people into mindless, aggressive creatures. Madison's first instinct was to protect and serve, just as she had sworn to do, but as she watched her fellow officers receiving similar calls, she realized this wasn't going to be an ordinary day of law enforcement. The initial reports seemed almost too bizarre to believe. People attacking others with unprecedented ferocity, showing no signs of pain or rational thought, and demonstrating an alarming resistance to conventional methods of restraint. As Madison drove toward the first reported incident, she passed Maria Santos jogging through Steele Indian School Park, completely unaware that her morning routine was about to be interrupted by the most challenging situation of her life. Maria had been training for the Phoenix Marathon for months, her dedication evident in every powerful stride she took around the park's familiar paths. As a personal trainer and former college athlete, she prided herself on maintaining peak physical condition, but more importantly, she had developed an unshakable mental toughness that her clients often admired. The 32-year-old had overcome numerous obstacles in her life, from growing up in a single-parent household to working multiple jobs while earning her fitness certifications, and she approached every challenge with the same determination that had carried her through those difficult times. When she noticed several people stumbling strangely near the park's entrance, her first thought was that someone might need medical assistance, and true to her nature, she immediately changed course to offer help. However, as she got closer, something about their movements seemed fundamentally wrong. Their limbs moved with jerky, unnatural motions, and their eyes held no recognition or awareness of their surroundings. Maria's athletic instincts kicked in as she realized these individuals weren't sick in any conventional sense, but rather seemed to be operating on some primitive, predatory level that made every fiber of her being scream danger. Meanwhile, across town in the upscale Scottsdale neighborhood, Jessica Thompson was putting the finishing touches on a multi-million-dollar real estate deal when her phone began buzzing with increasingly frantic messages. At 35, Jessica had built her reputation as one of Arizona's most successful real estate agents through a combination of sharp intelligence, unwavering determination, and an ability to remain calm under pressure that had served her well in countless high-stakes negotiations. Her corner office provided a panoramic view of the city, and from her 20th floor vantage point, she began to notice unusual activity in the streets below. Emergency vehicles racing in all directions, people running seemingly at random, and what appeared to be several small crowds gathering in ways that seemed both urgent and chaotic. Jessica's business acumen had taught her to quickly assess situations and identify potential problems before they became crises, and something about the scene unfolding below triggered every warning signal she had developed over years of reading people and situations. She grabbed her keys and headed for the elevator, her mind already working through potential scenarios and solutions, though nothing in her extensive experience had prepared her for the reality she was about to encounter on the ground level. Dr. Amanda Foster had been working a double shift at Phoenix General Hospital when the first wave of unusual patients began arriving, and her initial assumption was that they were dealing with some form of mass food poisoning or chemical exposure. As the head of the emergency department, the 40-year-old physician had seen nearly everything during her 15-year career, from multi-car accidents to rare tropical diseases, but the patients now filling her emergency room presented symptoms unlike anything in her medical training. They showed extreme aggression, complete lack of response to pain stimuli, and most disturbing of all, they seemed to be attempting to bite anyone who came within reach, forcing the medical staff to implement unprecedented security measures. Amanda's analytical mind worked frantically to identify patterns and potential treatments, but each new case only deepened the mystery and heightened her growing concern that they were facing something far beyond conventional medical understanding. Her nursing staff looked to her for guidance and reassurance, and despite her own mounting fears, she knew that maintaining her professional composure could mean the difference between organized response and complete chaos in the hospital's critical care areas. As the crisis intensified throughout the afternoon, these four women found themselves facing challenges that would test not only their individual strengths and skills, but also their ability to work together as an unlikely team. Madison's law enforcement training, Maria's physical conditioning, Jessica's strategic thinking, and Amanda's medical expertise would all prove essential as they navigated a rapidly deteriorating situation that seemed to grow more dangerous with each passing hour. The zombie outbreak, as it would later be called, had begun with isolated incidents, but the infection spread with terrifying efficiency through the interconnected urban landscape of metropolitan Phoenix. Each woman would discover reserves of courage and resourcefulness they never knew they possessed, while also learning that their survival might depend on their ability to trust and support others in ways they had never imagined. The battle for their city, their lives, and perhaps the future of humanity itself was about to begin, and these four extraordinary American women would find themselves at the very center of humanity's fight for survival against an enemy that showed no mercy, felt no pain, and had only one driving instinct: to spread their condition to every living person they could reach. The chaos escalated rapidly as Madison found herself face to face with her first infected individual outside a downtown coffee shop, where what had once been a mild-mannered businessman now lunged at her with animalistic fury, his business suit torn and stained with substances she preferred not to identify. Her police training kicked in automatically as she reached for her taser, but the electrical shock that would have incapacitated any normal person seemed to have little effect beyond causing the creature to stumble momentarily before resuming its relentless advance toward her. Madison's years of martial arts training, something she had pursued both for personal fitness and professional development, suddenly became her most valuable asset as she used the infected person's momentum against him, executing a perfect hip throw that sent him crashing into a nearby storefront window. However, her relief was short-lived as she realized that the sound of breaking glass had attracted the attention of several other infected individuals who had been wandering aimlessly down the street, and they were now converging on her location with the single-minded determination of predators who had just located their prey. Madison's radio crackled with desperate calls from fellow officers reporting similar encounters throughout the city, and she began to understand that traditional law enforcement protocols were not going to be sufficient for dealing with this unprecedented threat. Meanwhile, Maria had managed to outrun the initial group of infected individuals in the park, her superior cardiovascular fitness giving her a significant advantage, but she quickly discovered that escape was only a temporary solution when the entire city seemed to be falling into chaos around her. Her decision to head toward the main road proved both fortunate and terrifying as she encountered Jessica Thompson, who had abandoned her luxury sedan after it became trapped in a massive traffic jam caused by panicking citizens and emergency vehicles trying to navigate the increasingly dangerous streets. Jessica's business attire was hardly suitable for the physical demands of surviving a crisis, but her quick thinking had led her to grab a tire iron from her trunk before leaving the vehicle, and she wielded it with surprising effectiveness when two infected individuals approached them near an overturned food truck. Maria's athletic abilities combined with Jessica's strategic mind created an unexpectedly effective partnership as they worked together to clear a path through the chaos, with Maria using her speed and agility to distract the infected while Jessica struck with precision at critical moments. The two women discovered that communication and coordination were essential for survival, and despite their very different backgrounds and personalities, they began to develop a mutual respect based on their complementary skills and shared determination to survive. Back at Phoenix General Hospital, Dr. Amanda Foster was struggling to maintain order as the emergency department became overwhelmed with both infected patients and terrified citizens seeking shelter and medical attention. Her medical knowledge proved invaluable as she began to identify patterns in the infection's progression, noting that the transformation from normal human behavior to aggressive, mindless attacking seemed to occur within approximately 30 to 45 minutes of initial exposure, usually through bite wounds that carried some form of pathogen her laboratory equipment couldn't immediately identify. Amanda's leadership skills were tested to their limits as she coordinated with her nursing staff to establish quarantine protocols, secure medication supplies, and create barriers to separate infected patients from those who were still unaffected. The hospital security guards, initially confident in their ability to handle disruptive patients, found themselves completely unprepared for the strength and persistence of the infected individuals, who seemed immune to pain and showed no response to verbal commands or physical restraint techniques that had always been effective in the past. Amanda realized that the hospital's standard lockdown procedures were inadequate for containing patients who had no regard for their own safety and possessed an almost supernatural ability to break through barriers that should have been impossible for normal humans to breach. As evening approached and the situation continued to deteriorate, fate began to draw the four women together through a series of circumstances that would prove crucial for their survival and the survival of countless others who would depend on their courage and resourcefulness in the dark days ahead. Madison's patrol route led her toward the hospital where she hoped to coordinate with medical personnel and establish a safe zone for uninfected civilians, while Maria and Jessica found themselves moving in the same direction as they sought medical attention for Jessica's injured wrist, which had been twisted during their earlier encounter with the infected. The convergence of these four extraordinary women at Phoenix General Hospital would mark the beginning of their transformation from individual survivors into a coordinated team capable of mounting an effective resistance against the zombie outbreak that threatened to consume their entire city, and potentially spread far beyond the borders of Arizona to engulf the entire nation in chaos and terror. The hospital parking garage became an unexpected battleground as Madison arrived to find Maria and Jessica fighting desperately against a group of infected individuals who had cornered them near the elevator banks, their growls and snarls echoing through the concrete structure in a symphony of horror that would haunt the survivors for years to come. Madison's tactical training immediately assessed the situation as she drew her service weapon, but her hesitation to fire at what had once been human beings cost precious seconds that nearly proved fatal when one of the infected managed to grab Jessica's ankle as she attempted to climb onto a parked car for safety. Maria's quick reflexes and powerful kick sent the creature sprawling backward, giving Madison the opening she needed to take decisive action, though she discovered that her ammunition was far less effective than expected, requiring multiple shots to neutralize each threat in a way that challenged everything she had learned about stopping power and target engagement. The three women's first meeting was baptized by violence and terror, but also by an immediate recognition that their individual skills complemented each other in ways that could mean the difference between survival and becoming part of the growing horde of infected that seemed to multiply with each passing hour throughout the city. Dr. Amanda Foster's voice echoed through the hospital's public address system as she coordinated the lockdown procedures, her calm professional demeanor providing a crucial anchor of stability for both staff and patients who were struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the crisis unfolding around them. When Madison, Maria, and Jessica burst through the emergency department doors, covered in blood and debris from their parking garage encounter, Amanda immediately recognized them as uninfected survivors and quickly ushered them into a secure conference room where she could assess their condition and gather intelligence about the situation in the outside world. Amanda's medical examination revealed that none of the three women had been bitten, but her growing understanding of the infection's transmission methods led her to implement strict decontamination protocols that, while necessary for safety, also served to underscore the deadly serious nature of their predicament. The four women found themselves united not only by circumstance but by a shared realization that the normal world they had known just hours earlier had ceased to exist, replaced by a nightmare scenario where basic human survival instincts would determine who lived and who joined the ranks of the mindless infected. Their first strategic planning session took place in Amanda's office, where medical charts and patient files were quickly replaced by hastily drawn maps of the hospital layout and surrounding city blocks, as the four women began to pool their knowledge and expertise to develop a survival plan that could protect not only themselves but also the dozens of uninfected people who had sought refuge within the hospital's walls. Madison's law enforcement experience provided crucial insights into defensive positioning and resource management, while Maria's physical fitness expertise helped them understand the importance of maintaining their strength and endurance for the long-term challenges ahead. Jessica's business acumen proved invaluable as she analyzed supply chains and logistical challenges, quickly identifying potential shortage points for food, water, and medical supplies that could become critical vulnerabilities if not addressed immediately. Amanda's medical knowledge allowed her to brief the others on what she had learned about the infection's progression, including her disturbing observation that the infected seemed to retain some primitive problem-solving abilities, making them far more dangerous than the mindless zombies depicted in popular culture. As night fell over Phoenix, the hospital became a fortress of hope surrounded by an increasingly hostile environment where the sounds of breaking glass, screaming sirens, and inhuman growls created a constant backdrop of tension and fear that tested the resolve of everyone inside. The four women established a command structure based on their respective areas of expertise, with Amanda taking overall leadership due to her familiarity with the hospital and her natural authority as a physician, Madison handling security and defense planning, Maria managing physical training and fitness maintenance for all survivors, and Jessica coordinating supply management and long-term strategic planning. Their first major test came when a group of infected patients who had been in the hospital's psychiatric ward during the initial outbreak managed to break through the barriers that had been hastily erected to contain them, forcing the newly formed team to implement their defensive plans under live combat conditions that left no room for error or hesitation. The successful repulsion of this internal threat proved to all 4 women that their collaboration was not just beneficial but absolutely essential for survival, and it marked the moment when they truly began to function as a unified force rather than 4 individuals who happened to be working together out of necessity and convenience. The dawn of the second day brought with it a sobering realization that their sanctuary at Phoenix General Hospital was becoming increasingly precarious as the infected population outside continued to grow exponentially, and the sounds of helicopters overhead suggested that government authorities were beginning to implement containment measures that might not distinguish between the infected and the uninfected survivors trapped within the quarantine zone. Madison's attempts to maintain radio contact with her police department had yielded increasingly sporadic responses, with the last transmission indicating that multiple precincts had been overrun and that officers were being instructed to establish independent safe zones rather than attempt to maintain normal patrol operations. The hospital's backup generators had kicked in after the main power grid failed during the night, but Amanda's calculations indicated that their fuel reserves would last no more than 72 hours under current consumption rates, creating an urgent need to either secure additional fuel supplies or find alternative shelter before their defensive capabilities were compromised by darkness and failing security systems. Maria had spent the early morning hours conducting reconnaissance missions through the hospital's upper floors, using her athletic abilities to move quickly and quietly through areas that might harbor hidden infected, and her reports painted a grim picture of a building that was slowly being infiltrated despite their best efforts to maintain secure perimeters. Jessica's business instincts had led her to establish contact with other survivor groups throughout the city using the hospital's landline telephone system, which had remained operational even after cellular networks had failed, and her negotiations had resulted in a tentative alliance with a group of military veterans who had fortified a sporting goods store approximately 2 miles from the hospital. The proposed plan involved a coordinated evacuation that would allow the hospital survivors to reach the better-defended location while providing the veterans with access to medical supplies and Amanda's expertise in treating injuries that were becoming increasingly common as survivor groups engaged in more frequent combat with the infected. However, the route between the 2 locations passed through several areas that satellite reconnaissance had identified as heavily infested with infected individuals, making the journey extremely dangerous and requiring careful planning to maximize their chances of success while minimizing casualties among the civilians they had sworn to protect. Madison's tactical analysis of the proposed route identified several choke points where the group could become trapped if they encountered larger numbers of infected than anticipated, but she also recognized that remaining at the hospital was becoming untenable as their supplies dwindled and the infected population outside continued to probe their defenses with what seemed like increasing intelligence and coordination. The decision to attempt the evacuation was made more urgent by Amanda's discovery that several survivors who had seemed perfectly healthy were beginning to show early symptoms of infection despite having no visible bite marks or other obvious exposure to the pathogen. Her medical investigation revealed that the infection could apparently be transmitted through airborne particles in certain circumstances, particularly in enclosed spaces where infected individuals had been present for extended periods, suggesting that the hospital itself might be becoming contaminated in ways that traditional quarantine measures could not prevent. This revelation forced the team to accelerate their timeline dramatically, as they realized that every hour spent in the potentially compromised environment increased their risk of infection, while also making the prospect of moving dozens of survivors through infected territory seem like an impossible task that could result in the deaths of everyone they were trying to save. Maria's physical conditioning became crucial as she volunteered to serve as an advance scout for the evacuation route, using her speed and endurance to identify safe passage points and potential shelter locations, while also assessing the density and behavior patterns of infected groups that blocked their intended path to the sporting goods store. The complexity of coordinating a large group evacuation through hostile territory required all 4 women to push their leadership abilities to new limits as they dealt with frightened civilians who were reluctant to leave what they perceived as safety, medical patients who might not survive the journey, and the constant threat of infection spreading within their own group during the stress and chaos of movement. Jessica's organizational skills proved invaluable as she created detailed logistics plans for transporting medical equipment, food supplies, and weapons, while also establishing communication protocols that would allow the group to maintain coordination even if they became separated during the evacuation process. Madison's law enforcement experience helped her identify potential security risks within their own group, as the stress and fear of the situation had begun to create tensions between survivors that could compromise their unity and effectiveness if not addressed promptly and decisively. Amanda found herself making increasingly difficult medical decisions about which patients could be moved safely, and which might need to be left behind with volunteers who would essentially be sacrificing themselves to provide care for those too weak or injured to make the journey, creating moral dilemmas that had no easy answers but required immediate resolution as time continued to work against them in their desperate struggle for survival and safety. The evacuation began at dawn on the third day with Maria leading the first scout team through the hospital's maintenance tunnels, a route that Jessica had discovered during her systematic exploration of the building's blueprints and architectural plans that she had requisitioned from the hospital's administrative offices. The underground passages provided temporary concealment from the infected hordes that had gathered in the streets above, but they also presented new dangers in the form of cramped spaces, limited visibility, and the constant risk of becoming trapped if they encountered infected individuals who had somehow gained access to the tunnel system. Madison coordinated the movement of the main group, which consisted of 43 survivors including medical staff, patients who were stable enough to travel, and civilians who had sought refuge at the hospital during the initial outbreak, organizing them into smaller units that could move more quickly and quietly while also providing mutual support if any group encountered trouble during the journey. Amanda brought up the rear with a medical team carrying essential supplies and equipment, her trained eye constantly assessing the condition of the survivors to ensure that no one was showing signs of infection that could compromise the entire group's safety during their most vulnerable period of movement through potentially hostile territory. The first major obstacle came when Maria's scout team discovered that a section of the tunnel system had partially collapsed, apparently due to explosions or heavy fighting in the area above, forcing them to find an alternative route that would require the group to travel above ground for approximately 6 city blocks through an area that recent reconnaissance had identified as heavily populated with infected individuals. Jessica's quick thinking led to the development of a distraction strategy using the hospital's emergency vehicles, with Madison using her police training to hotwire several ambulances and create a convoy that could draw the infected away from the route the survivors would need to take on foot. The plan required precise timing and coordination, as the vehicles would need to maintain the distraction long enough for all 43 survivors to cross the dangerous zone, but not so long that the drivers themselves would be overwhelmed by the infected crowds they were attempting to lure away from the main group. Maria's physical conditioning proved crucial as she volunteered to serve as a runner between the different elements of the operation, carrying communications and status updates that allowed Madison to adjust the timing of the distraction based on real-time intelligence about infected movement patterns and group positioning. The crossing itself became a harrowing test of nerve and endurance as the survivors moved in small groups through abandoned storefronts and office buildings, using Jessica's pre-planned route that took advantage of interior passages and rooftop connections to minimize their exposure to street-level threats while still maintaining forward progress toward their destination. Amanda's medical expertise became essential when several survivors suffered injuries during the crossing, including an elderly man who fell through a weakened floor and a young mother who twisted her ankle while carrying her infant child across a gap between buildings, requiring immediate treatment that had to be administered under combat conditions with infected individuals potentially just minutes away from discovering their location. The sound discipline that Madison had insisted upon during their planning sessions proved its worth as the group managed to maintain near-total silence despite the stress and physical demands of the journey, though several close calls with roaming infected individuals reminded everyone that a single mistake or moment of carelessness could result in the discovery and destruction of their entire group. The emotional toll of the evacuation became apparent as they reached the halfway point, with several survivors beginning to show signs of severe psychological stress that manifested in panic attacks, uncontrolled weeping, and in one case, a complete breakdown that required Maria to physically carry an unconscious woman while Jessica took responsibility for the survivor's young son who had become catatonic with fear. Amanda's medical training included psychology and trauma response, allowing her to provide emergency mental health support that helped several survivors regain their composure and continue with the group, but she also recognized that the long-term psychological effects of their experiences would require extensive treatment that might not be available in their new post-apocalyptic reality. The realization that they were not just fighting for physical survival but also for their collective sanity and humanity added another layer of complexity to their mission, as they understood that saving lives would be meaningless if the survivors were too damaged psychologically to rebuild any semblance of normal life once the immediate crisis had passed. As they approached the final stretch of their journey, the sporting goods store came into view, but so did a massive horde of infected individuals that had gathered around the building, apparently drawn by the sounds and activities of the veteran survivors who had been fortifying their position and conducting their own supply raids throughout the city. The sight of hundreds of infected creatures surrounding their intended destination created a moment of despair that threatened to break the morale of the exhausted survivors, but it also galvanized the four women's determination to complete their mission successfully, as they realized that turning back was no longer an option and that their only path to safety lay through the seemingly impenetrable wall of infected individuals that stood between them and their allies inside the store. Madison's tactical expertise became the cornerstone of their desperate final assault as she analyzed the infected horde's positioning and identified a weakness in their formation where a delivery truck had crashed into the store's loading dock, creating a potential breach point that could allow the survivors to reach safety if they could clear a narrow corridor through the infected masses. Her plan required splitting their group into three coordinated elements. Maria would lead a high-speed diversionary attack from the east side of the building, using her athletic abilities and makeshift explosive devices created from cleaning supplies found in a nearby restaurant to draw the majority of the infected away from the loading dock area. Jessica would coordinate the movement of the civilian survivors through the cleared corridor, using her organizational skills to maintain group cohesion and ensure that no one was left behind during the chaotic final sprint to safety. Amanda would establish a mobile medical station at the midpoint of their approach route, providing emergency treatment for anyone who was injured during the assault while also serving as a communication hub to coordinate the timing of each element's movements for maximum effectiveness and minimal casualties. The diversionary attack began with Maria's spectacular entrance as she emerged from a second-story window of an adjacent office building, rappelling down a makeshift rope system that Jessica had rigged using climbing equipment salvaged from the sporting goods store's exterior display cases during their reconnaissance mission the previous evening. Maria's improvised explosives created enough noise and destruction to draw approximately two-thirds of the infected horde away from the loading dock, but the remaining creatures still presented a formidable obstacle that would require direct confrontation to clear the path for the civilian survivors who lacked the combat training and physical conditioning necessary to fight their way through even a reduced number of infected opponents. Madison's police training and firearms expertise proved crucial as she led a small team of the most capable survivors in a precision attack designed to eliminate the remaining infected individuals quickly and efficiently, though she discovered that headshots were the only reliably effective method of stopping the creatures, requiring a level of marksmanship that pushed her skills to their absolute limits under combat stress conditions. The civilian evacuation through the cleared corridor became a race against time as the infected individuals who had been drawn away by Maria's distraction began to return to the area, apparently following some form of herd instinct that brought them back to their original positions once the immediate stimulus of the explosions had faded from their primitive consciousness. Jessica's leadership during this critical phase demonstrated her ability to remain calm under extreme pressure as she guided families with young children, elderly survivors, and injured individuals through the narrow passage while constantly adjusting their route to avoid infected stragglers who had not been fully cleared from the area. Amanda's medical station became a crucial waypoint where several survivors received emergency treatment for injuries sustained during the assault, including a teenage boy who had been scratched by an infected individual's fingernails and required immediate wound cleaning and antiseptic treatment to prevent infection. Though Amanda's growing understanding of the pathogen's transmission methods left her uncertain about the effectiveness of traditional medical interventions against this unprecedented biological threat. The final moments of their assault on the sporting goods store required all four women to demonstrate levels of courage and determination that surprised even themselves as they realized that their coordinated attack had successfully opened a path to safety, but that maintaining that path would require continued combat against infected individuals who seemed to be converging on their location from throughout the surrounding neighborhood. Maria's athletic conditioning allowed her to continue fighting effectively even after sustaining multiple minor injuries during her diversionary mission, while Madison's law enforcement training helped her maintain tactical awareness and coordinate defensive positions that protected the survivors as they entered the store through the breached loading dock. Jessica's business acumen proved valuable in the final phase as she quickly established communication with the veteran survivors inside the store, negotiating the terms of their integration into the existing group and ensuring that the medical supplies and expertise they brought would be properly utilized to benefit all survivors rather than creating conflicts over resources and leadership responsibilities. The successful completion of their evacuation mission marked a turning point not only in their individual survival stories but also in their understanding of what would be required to rebuild some form of civilization in a world that had been fundamentally transformed by the zombie outbreak, as they realized that their combined skills and leadership abilities had enabled them to accomplish something that none of them could have achieved working alone. Amanda's medical knowledge, Madison's tactical expertise, Maria's physical capabilities, and Jessica's organizational skills had proven to be complementary elements of a leadership team that could potentially serve as a model for other survivor groups throughout the region. Though they also understood that their success had come at a significant cost in terms of the physical and emotional toll on everyone involved in the dangerous journey from the hospital to their new stronghold. The integration with the veteran survivors at the sporting goods store initially presented unexpected challenges as the military-trained men had developed their own leadership structure and operational procedures during the weeks they had spent fortifying their position, creating potential conflicts over decision-making authority and resource allocation that threatened to undermine the unity necessary for long-term survival in their increasingly hostile environment. However, the veterans' leader, a former Marine sergeant named Robert Harrison, quickly recognized the value that the 4 women brought to their group, particularly Amanda's irreplaceable medical expertise and the proven effectiveness of their coordinated leadership style that had successfully guided 43 civilians through the most dangerous evacuation mission any of them had ever witnessed. The establishment of a joint command structure required delicate negotiations that drew heavily on Jessica's business experience in managing mergers and acquisitions, as she worked to create a governance system that respected both the veterans' military hierarchy and the women's demonstrated competence in crisis management, while ensuring that all survivors had a voice in decisions that affected their safety and well-being. Madison's law enforcement background proved invaluable in developing comprehensive security protocols for their expanded survivor community, as she worked with the veterans to establish patrol schedules, communication procedures, and defensive positions that could protect nearly 100 people against the constant threat of infected attacks while also maintaining the operational flexibility necessary to conduct supply raids and rescue missions throughout the surrounding area. Her analysis of the infected population's behavior patterns had revealed disturbing evidence that the creatures were beginning to display more sophisticated hunting strategies, including what appeared to be coordinated group tactics and the ability to set simple ambushes, suggesting that the pathogen might be evolving or that some infected individuals retained more cognitive function than previously believed. This discovery forced the entire survivor community to re-evaluate their defensive strategies and led to the implementation of much more rigorous security measures that required significant changes to their daily routines and operational procedures. Though Madison's expertise in threat assessment helped them maintain an appropriate balance between security and the freedom of movement necessary for psychological well-being. Maria's role in the expanded community evolved beyond physical fitness and combat training, as she discovered that her natural leadership abilities and empathetic personality made her an effective liaison between different survivor groups, particularly in mediating conflicts between the hospital civilians and the more militaristic veterans who sometimes had difficulty understanding the needs and concerns of non-combatants. Her establishment of physical training programs for all community members, regardless of age or previous fitness level, proved crucial in maintaining morale and building the sense of collective capability that was essential for group cohesion in their dangerous new reality. The discovery that regular exercise and structured activities helped combat the depression and anxiety that threatened to overwhelm many survivors led Maria to expand her programs to include recreational activities and team-building exercises that strengthened social bonds while also improving the community's overall physical preparedness for the challenges they faced on a daily basis. Amanda's medical responsibilities expanded dramatically as she found herself serving not only as the community's primary physician but also as their scientific researcher, tasked with studying the infection and developing potential treatments or preventive measures that could protect their group and potentially contribute to larger efforts to combat the zombie outbreak. Her establishment of a fully equipped medical facility within the sporting goods store required extensive coordination with Jessica to identify and acquire necessary supplies and equipment through carefully planned raids on area hospitals and pharmacies, missions that often required the combined skills of all 4 women to execute successfully while minimizing casualties and exposure to infection. The psychological counseling services that Amanda provided became increasingly important as survivors struggled with trauma, grief, and the constant stress of living under siege conditions, and her development of group therapy sessions helped create support networks that strengthened the community's emotional resilience and ability to cope with ongoing challenges. Jessica's organizational expertise became the foundation for their community's long-term sustainability as she developed comprehensive resource management systems that tracked everything from food and water supplies to ammunition and medical equipment, ensuring that shortages could be anticipated and addressed before they became critical threats to the group's survival. Her establishment of trade relationships with other survivor communities throughout the region created a network of mutual support that increased their access to essential supplies while also provided intelligence about infected population movements and the activities of potentially hostile human groups that posed different but equally serious threats to their security. The communication systems that Jessica implemented, using salvaged radio equipment and carefully planned message schedules, allowed their community to serve as a coordination hub for survivor activities throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area, giving them influence and importance that extended far beyond their immediate geographical location, and establishing them as leaders in the emerging post-apocalyptic society that was slowly taking shape among the scattered remnants of human civilization. 6 months after the initial outbreak, the 4 women found themselves at the center of what had become the largest and most successful survivor community in the southwestern United States, with their combined leadership having transformed a desperate band of refugees into a thriving settlement of over 300 people who had not only survived the zombie apocalypse but had begun to rebuild the foundations of organized society. Amanda's medical research had yielded breakthrough discoveries about the infection's transmission mechanisms and potential weaknesses, leading to the development of experimental treatments that showed promising results in preventing the progression of early-stage infections. Though her work remained limited by the lack of sophisticated laboratory equipment and the constant danger involved in obtaining infected tissue samples for study, her establishment of a medical training program had created a cadre of paramedics and nurses who could provide basic healthcare throughout their expanding territory, while her psychological counseling services had evolved into a comprehensive mental health support system that helped survivors maintain their humanity and hope despite the ongoing horrors of their transformed world. Madison's security operations had expanded to include not only defensive measures but also offensive campaigns designed to systematically clear infected populations from strategic areas, allowing for the safe expansion of their territory and the establishment of agricultural zones that were essential for long-term food security and community growth. Her development of specialized tactics for combating the evolved infected variants that continued to emerge had proven so effective that other survivor communities regularly requested her assistance in training their own defense forces, making her expertise a valuable commodity in the intercommunity trade networks that Jessica had established throughout the region. The intelligence gathering network that Madison had created using former law enforcement personnel and military veterans provided early warning of both infected horde movements and hostile human activities, giving their community significant advantages in preparing for threats and coordinating responses with allied groups across a territory that now extended over several hundred square miles. Maria's physical training programs had evolved into a comprehensive education system that included not only fitness and combat instruction but also practical skills like farming, construction, and mechanical repair that were essential for rebuilding civilization in a world where traditional infrastructure and supply chains had been destroyed. Her natural charisma and leadership abilities had made her the unofficial ambassador for their community, representing their interests in negotiations with other survivor groups and government remnants while also serving as the primary coordinator for joint operations and mutual defense agreements that strengthened the entire regional survivor network. The youth programs that Maria had developed ensured that the next generation would possess both the physical capabilities and mental resilience necessary to thrive in their dangerous new world, while also maintaining connections to the cultural values and social structures that would be necessary for eventually rebuilding a recognizable form of human civilization. Jessica's economic innovations had created the foundation for a new form of post-apocalyptic commerce based on resource sharing, skill exchange, and cooperative defense agreements that allowed multiple survivor communities to achieve levels of prosperity and security that would have been impossible for any single group working in isolation. Her negotiation of territorial agreements and trade routes had prevented numerous conflicts between survivor groups while also facilitating the flow of information and resources that enabled collective responses to large-scale threats like massive, infected hordes or organized bandit attacks that required coordinated multi-community defense efforts. The governance structures that Jessica had helped establish balanced democratic decision-making with the need for rapid response capabilities during emergencies, creating a flexible system that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the legitimacy and popular support necessary for long-term stability and growth. As they stood together on the roof of their fortified headquarters, looking out over a community that bustled with activity and purpose despite the ongoing dangers that surrounded them on all sides, the 4 women reflected on how far they had traveled from that first desperate day when they had met during the chaos of the initial outbreak. Their individual strengths had been amplified through their collaboration, creating a leadership team whose effectiveness had not only saved hundreds of lives but had also provided a model for human cooperation and resilience that offered hope for the eventual recovery of civilization from the zombie apocalypse that had seemed so overwhelming just months earlier. The challenges ahead remained formidable, with infected populations still numbering in the millions and hostile human groups continuing to pose threats to peaceful communities, but their success had proven that determined individuals working together could overcome seemingly impossible odds and build something better from the ashes of the old world. Their legacy would not be measured simply in terms of survival, but in their demonstration that even in humanity's darkest hour, courage, intelligence, and cooperation could triumph over chaos and despair, laying the groundwork for a future where their children and grandchildren might once again live in a world where hope was stronger than fear and where the bonds between people were more powerful than the forces that sought to destroy them.